Okay. So for folks attending also, I'll just note one other AgriLife Extension colleague here, Dr. Tom Isakey with Plant Pathology in College Station is also joining us. Tom, thank you. Uh, Tom, it was over a year ago that we met with Texas Department of Ag in Austin. I can't believe it's been that long, but we've been working in a different way since. So just a few things today is my intent is to overview, especially for our county extension faculty, just where we are with hemp, some of the issues that we've encountered. This is not a production session. There's another time to go into some of the nitty gritty of details. We will talk about a few things here, but as AgriLife moved forward on this in 2020, there's varieties, there's markets, there's how do we grow, what kind of pests are we going to encounter, how do we harvest and dry, and a big question for me and for the people I talk with is, if you grew hemp in 2020, what will you do differently in 2021? I am sure there is something that you're going to do differently. That is the case for me. And a lot of this process for our clientele starts with Texas Department of Agriculture. So the legislature, okay, 2018 Farm Bill, December 2018, the legislature met at the convened at the end of January 2019. They had time to get hemp legislation introduced, discussed, amended, and passed, signed by the governor. And then Texas Department of Agriculture's mandate is to develop a hemp program based on federal guidelines, which were not finalized until this past February. So if you go on the main TDA website, this is the link here at the bottom. The key here is you get down to the section down the page, the handlers, the varieties that are approved to grow in Texas, where you would get testing. There are sampling and collection procedures that you have to follow in order to get the official THC test that is required before you harvest. We'll talk about that later. Another change or another item of interest is just the legislation, and TDA implemented a number of fees and permits that are necessary for the process. Also in these rules are the situation if your hemp crop goes hot, that is above 0.3% THC, then there are also guidelines on how it must be destroyed. And that's a difficult situation. I'm not really sure how much of that occurred in Texas in 2020. I know some people had to destroy their crop, but mostly it was on small scale. TDA issued 861 grower licenses last year. Those licenses are good for 1 year. They can be renewed. They issued a permit on about 5,000 acres, but I think only a little over 2,000 of those were actually planted. So here's the permits. This goes back to the TDA website. You have a facility permit. So that's your field, your barn, wherever you handle your hemp. If it's your farmstead, that can be one facility. If you have where you're going to handle your hemp is one location, and where you grow it's a mile or two down the road, that's two facilities, and you have to have a permit for each location. There's a lot permit, one per variety for each location. Why? One lot permit per variety. Each variety has to be tested by itself for THC, and you have transport permits. The official sampling has changed since last year. 2020, you had to sample within 15 days of harvest. Now it's 30. That's what some states had done. We'll also talk about this a little bit more. There are approved varieties from TDA. These are not certified varieties, they're approved. And there's two processes by which that's been done. There's an application process, and TDA also took it upon themselves to approve varieties that were already certified in other states. Now, a key difference here, and this is one I didn't realize, is Texas Department of Ag oversees the growing aspect, the handling, the transport. Texas Department of State Health Services oversees consumables. So a cream, a gummy, something that would be maybe used for smoking. And Department of State Health Services has chose at this time not to permit smokable hemp in Texas. Now, this is not marijuana type hemp, it's just smokable. Still has to be less than 0.3% THC. Why smoke? Smoking CBD, quicker absorption, terpenes, flavors, aromatics, those types of things. There is a lawsuit in place that an injunction from a judge is temporarily permitting the sale of smokable hemp in Texas. This is the market that is attractive to a lot of very small acreage producers because of the potential higher value. So in the federal law, as noted, 0.3% THC plus or minus the error from the analytical procedure. That will be less than 10%. It could be 5 or 6%. And so probably if you're at 0.32%, you're probably okay. 0.33, that's questionable. You can't go to your field and resample to challenge the 0.33 or the 0.40. It could be retested if you ask for it. But what I've learned, I handled all of my samples last year for my Lubbock trials. And there's two things. This 0.3% THC to me makes me nervous because I realize there's potentially the most error in probably how the sample is collected in the field, which you have no control over as a grower. You have a sampler licensed by TDA that has to collect that. The second thing is how that sample is handled after it's collected in terms of drying, what is sent to the lab, how they process it, and so forth. And so I think you will see in time this year in Texas, probably some information jointly between TDA and AgriLife in terms of suggestions on how to collect that sample, how to handle that sample for consistency, and so that you don't maybe unwittingly end up collecting in such a way or handling in such a way that produces more likely a hot THC. I'm somewhat surprised by this, but nobody's bothered by it. Department of Public Safety, our county sheriffs, local police departments to date have really been very hands-off towards hemp. I've only had one law enforcement inquiry since the beginning of January in 2020. So A&M AgriLife has a hemp program, and these are a few key elements in how we handle this. My immediate supervisor, extension program lead for soil and crop sciences, Dr. Larry Redmond, coordinates AgriLife hemp activities. So this does not include educational programs, but if you are going to be handling hemp in any capacity, a field trial, something like that, then he needs to be notified in advance, and you need to submit a plan for that work in advance. I serve as the extension hemp specialist. AgriLife Research, AgriLife Extension, each have our own license. This is an example of the TDA license for extension in the upper right-hand corner. There's only one license per agency. It covers all employees. We also have a chain of custody form. So for example, if I need to send a seed sample to Dr. De Silva at Weslaco, then I fill in a chain of custody form. This is in lieu of the state permit that a private individual would have to have, which is $75 in order to send that sample to Weslaco from Lubbock. So we appreciate TDA, and we've had a lot of opportunity to discuss with Texas Department of Agriculture numerous questions. It's helping us both, I think, do a better job. So for the planting of hemp, here is something, and maybe if you're a county agent, this is a relief, but for the time being, A&M system hemp program allows planting only on A&M properties or where A&M has a long-term lease, that is at least 3 more years to run on a lease. So a county ag agent would not be able to do a hemp variety trial unless it was at maybe one of the research stations, and then you would need to have a partner on station. So this also is convenient because, Todd, I don't know how many people have asked me, well, we have 5 acres north of Abilene. We want to make that available for Texas A&M so you can come and do some hemp work. Well, it's not A&M property. We don't control it. So that's not something that we would invest our time in. Any of the hemp work that we do, in contrast to a sunflower hybrid trial, a grain sorghum hybrid trial, a cotton variety trial, the hemp work is much more involved, much more expensive, much more time consuming to conduct. So our AgriLife partners, we don't have restrictions on where we plant. Common sense would say don't plant next to a blacktop road where a lot of people go by. We've had some people plant hay grazer or corn, something like that, that's tall to kind of hide the hemp. So a year ago, we would have asked this question in Texas, is hemp farming for you? We could also say, is hemp farming still for you? And some of the reasons why and why not would be reflected in the industry. Hemp Benchmarks is a popular publication, a massive amount of information. And I've had a chance to contribute to that on a monthly basis numerous times. But they recently commented they're seeing, again, another decrease in the licenses in the US, especially for CBD hemp. But it looks like the number of licenses for grain and fiber hemp are increasing. So how many different groups do I know of that have said, well, we're going to put in a processing plant at Lubbock. We're going to have a fiber processing plant at, in the Houston area, all these kind of comments. And here was one that commented about the opportunity they saw. This was a quote from them in a newsletter in December 19. Any landowner with an acre or more, a barn, a garage, that'd probably be to handle, and maybe a place you could dry your hemp, could make $50,000 or more in a year. That's the revenue. And that was true for a few people prior to 2019. Then we ended up with another 20 or 30 states growing hemp. We ended up with 132,000 acres in 2019, and that severely crimped the market. That same group said they would be building drying and warehouse facilities across Texas, a dozen or more. That group is gone. It didn't pan out. This was much more involved, much more complicated than they ever expected. And I think there was a lot of excitement and eagerness. This group they were in touch with Commissioner Miller. They were forward about, oh, well, we've been talking to Commissioner Miller, and they had, but there just wasn't the substance there in their plan to make any headway. So for hemp, you've got greenhouse production. That's going to be higher value crop. Smokable hemp is popularly mentioned for greenhouse production. Some folks in AgriLife, among colleagues, believe that greenhouse might be where most of in the long term, might be where cannabinoid hemp like CBD is going to be produced. Probably year round. Control under the conditions there, prevent pollen in the greenhouse. There might be some special issues with plant diseases or insects. You've got your small scale hobby type farms, half an acre, mostly all hand oriented. And then there is hemp production in Texas with individuals that are above 100 acres. And that is, with one exception that I know of, actually two, is for CBD. I have seen some growers in other states, Colorado, that have produced over 1,000 acres of CBD cropping in 1 year. And so if somebody's growing for 1 or 2 acres, they might think, how in the world do I compete against that? And it's a good question. I think a small acreage producer has the ability to shoot for a higher quality market, and that might be the differential there. So 2021, this graphic in the upper right-hand corner, the source of that information is now charging $495 a year for their information. So we stopped, but that curve looks no different. We could extend it to the right another 14 months and it's pretty flat. So we had a $4 price for each 1% of CBD per pound dry matter at the beginning of the 2019 cropping season. Today, that price is in the range of 60 cents. So it's down about 85%. How many people did we talk to in our 19 mini workshops across the state that didn't know this? And I think that popped their bubble, and it's what stopped a lot of people from planting hemp. Of the 861 grower licenses in Texas last year, I would estimate that at least a third of those never planted. Even though they had their license, they might have even bought their seed, but they realized that there was no economic sense. So hemp acres for CBD were down about 50% last year. It's expected to fall a little bit further. Uh, Hemp Benchmarks thinks that as little as 40,000 acres nationally could meet the hemp CBD demand. So divide that up across 40,000, or divide 40,000 acres across 40 or 45 states. You realize that this is a relatively minor acreage. It is a minor acreage. It has higher crop value in spite of the lower prices, but this is going to curtail a lot of the interest that we have in hemp. So we'll pause here after this slide. In 2020, was there anybody in Texas that appears to have made some money on hemp? And I think there's four areas here. You've got the highly specialized market that could have been the smokable, maybe a situation where a retail outlet, a chain of retail outlets want hand trimmed colas or heads for the hemp plant. That takes a lot of labor. Trimming all those what we call sugar leaves off the head so they can get the highest percentage of the cannabinoids, the terpenes, the CBD, and so forth. There's certified organic hemp, and there's a lot of hemp that's grown with organic methods, but it's not certified. This is for certified. Anyone here that grew their crop, they might have had to have someone extract it for them because they didn't have the equipment, which is expensive, but takes their distillate back and then makes their own cream, their own tincture, something like that, that they can market locally or regionally. There's the possibility that that vertical integration could allow them to capture the increased value of that product. The amount of CBD that's actually in, for example, a tincture, the amount of that price, the amount of that retail price that actually goes to the grower is very small. It's in the range of only 1 or 2%. In spite of the prices of the CBD paid to a grower. That's why this vertical integration is appealing. Lastly, we have some large scale farming here, and in the hemp world, there's clones and transplants. There's feminized seed, which would grow a female plant, and there's straight run seed, which grows a 50-50 mix of male and female plants. And those male plants are not removed from the field. If you have a half acre, an acre, you're going to watch for any plant that's male, and you'll try to remove it as soon as you can before it would shed any pollen, so you can avoid seed development in your hemp. But on a farm scale, this is not the case. Yes, their CBD will be lower. It can be done. I've probably had 7 or 8 people said that's not possible to grow hemp with straight run seed for CBD. It cannot be done. There's farmers that showed it's going to be done. In part, it looks like the folks here in the Lubbock region, it looks like they were able to reduce their per acre cost by about 2/3. You know, instead of $10,000 an acre, maybe even $12,000, it was more in the range of $3,000, maybe $4,000 at the most. So I'll pause here for a moment and see if we have any questions. Likewise, Todd, if you can keep an eye on the chat box just in case there's anything that's dropped there.
Yes, sir. I'm watching the chat, and yeah, it's time to. If you have any questions on your mind, just unmute your mic and ask away. We got the folks on that can answer them, or hit chat, and I'll be letting you know about that, Dr. Trussell.
Okay. All right.
Calvin?
Yes.
And you may be getting to this, but what is there still potential for the fiber market, or where's that at?
We will talk about that here shortly.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thanks.
And I didn't specifically put the Panda Biotech name in here, but we will mention that. So for 2021, with the low prices, what do? And if you're a grower, then this is a tough situation. How do you find a trusted buyer? Because we've already in Texas had individuals that, even if they had a contract, they disappeared. I think some of the folks that signed contracts in Texas and other states ended up with a buyer who recognized, I'm not going to make any money. I'm going to lose money if I pay this grower, and they disappear. We've heard this over and over in other states. So this is a difficult situation. And none of us in AgriLife really have any kind of a list about prospective buyers. If we had a short session with growers last night, and I told them, one of them asked is, well, who could I contact as a buyer? And I said, I have a couple of names that you might contact, but really, I don't have time to vet them to see if they're legit. And so that's a tough situation. I think really word of mouth around the industry helps you figure that out. But there's a lot of questions you need to add. And we recommend, if you have a contract, you have that reviewed by an attorney, because those contracts, some of the ones I've seen, were very, very favorable to the contractor. And they have a lot of our ag law specialist at Amarillo, Tiffany Adele Ashmetz, noted that some of those contracts appear to have outs in the favor of the contractor, and it could leave a grower. It's happened. They're stuck with something and they don't have a buyer. So can you cut costs? That would be your seeds or your transplants by 50%. And a caveat to that is, I've seen the first company now saying, "Oh, we started a sale on our hemp seed for 2021. Great, 50% off." What that tells me is the acres are going to be down further. They're seeing they've got several million feminized seed on hand, and they're afraid they're not going to get most of it sold. So they've cut their prices. That does not mean that that's a good deal. It might be on a variety that you've never heard of, or one that you just really, there's other choices that are better paying a regular price for. Can you reduce that labor by half or more? That means even on a half acre, an acre, you may need to figure out a way to somehow mechanize some of your operation. And likewise, our AgriLife extension budgets for different crops across the state, a lot of farmers don't include their land, their fixed costs like their land and so forth. Well, I see that small hemp growers don't value their time. They say, well, there's my revenue, here's what I spent, but that doesn't include their time, as if maybe they paid themselves $10 or $15 or $20 an hour. So there's a lot of ways to grow hemp. Your planting material, your goal and what you're shooting for, how your planting pattern, how you irrigate, if at all, how you dry, when you harvest. We do see this, the feedback we had from growers in Texas from 2020 that had hemp said that in general, if they'd had cotton on the same acre and grew that cotton at the level of productivity it would achieve, that they needed to water the hemp just a little bit more. And this is in contrast to some early thinking in AgriLife extension that hemp might require as little as 1/2 the water of cotton. And we never really thought that among the agronomists that was probably likely. And it looks like our farmers have kind of confirmed to us that, especially for higher value crop, even though prices are low, they need to ensure that water's on there. Now, this was new to me, but hemp has distinctly male and female plants. You can see the pollen sacs here on the male. You've got the budding of initial floral structures on the female. You can have a plant that has both. That's a hermaphrodite. They're not common. Most of your cannabinoid production comes from the floral structures of the female plant. The male plant can produce CBD at maybe 0.2%, very low, maybe on rare occasions 0.5%. The male plants, this is a dry land field actually, in the lower right. The male plants, once they shed their pollen, they're kind of done. They stop growing, they turn yellow, they senesce. For fiber biomass, where you would drill for fiber or grain, your male plants and female plants would be harvested for fiber. The male plants are probably on the order of maybe just 15 or 20% of the biomass based on what I've seen so far. So likewise, if you've got a whole plant harvest for CBD, the male plants, it's not a 50-50 issue. The biomass from the male is lower. So if you had a 10% CBD in your female plants, and you mix it in with the male plants, you're not going to end up at 5%. You might be maybe at 8%, maybe 8.5%. But within the hemp world for cannabinoids like CBD, there's been the assumption that it was not acceptable to have male plants in your production. People decry getting pollinated from a field 5 or 6 miles away, and then they get seed in their crop. And yes, that seed probably reduces their cannabinoid some, but there is a way forward to farm with straight run seed. And I think the larger farmers are going to figure that out and probably capture the market in time for cannabinoids that are extracted. So hemp varieties, this is a challenge here. This is something we're not used to among our crops. You know, if you planted a grain sorghum hybrid, there might be 50 or 60 hybrids that are available to you across Texas. But there's information about those varieties, the maturity, their yield potential, a company that can answer your questions. TDA has 413 approved hemp varieties. A few of those are grain. There's probably about 20 or 30 that are actually intended for fiber. Many of them probably would be dual purpose, but there's about 350 varieties for CBD. And so you could be an established company. Here's your variety. You send in the information that TDA requests and it's approved. You could say, well, I've got a variety and it's called Swift 101. You didn't know you were in the hemp seed business here, Todd. Swift 101. Here's my 3 certificates of analysis that show it's less than 0.3% THC. It's approved by TDA. And so that's a challenge there. There's over 30 of those varieties have the word cherry in their name. They're derivatives of cherry wine. A lot of these varieties are not very different. Too good to be true prices. We've seen that happen. We've seen junk seed. I had one clientele from Odessa said, well, do you know anything about, they named the seed company in Colorado. The seed I bought for them, and this fella had over 10 acres, over 20% of the seed generated a male plant, and the company will not answer his phone calls and stuff. And I said, you know, short of suing them, you need to notify TDA and see if the company was the one that submitted that variety for approval, and file a complaint with TDA, file a complaint with Colorado Department of Agriculture, put a little pressure on him. Somebody did him wrong. So, you know, in forages for hay grazer in Texas, we've got varieties like Sweeter and Honey or Super Sugar BMR. And those names like Sweeter and Honey and Super Sugar, that's a marketing tool. And you see the same thing in hemp cannabinoid varieties. They'll talk about the names, you know, Hawaiian Haze, just for example, all kinds of names that make you think that maybe remind you of marijuana, but fruity, nutty, terpenes, flavors, a woody aroma, those types of things are in the description of these varieties on the websites. It's all meaningless if the hemp is going for extraction. Those words only mean anything if they're accurate. They're all based on perception. They only mean anything if it's a smokable type hemp. If it's processed for extraction, none of that means anything. And so that's just a differential that some people don't realize. So this is really is kind of leads to one of my biggest questions here that we've had. And Jordan, I have wrestled with this a lot, but hemp varieties are heavily photoperiod sensitive. There are very few that are not, but a lot of varieties that have come into Texas, especially for fiber, also for grain, to a much lesser extent for cannabinoid production, they're all grown, they're all adapted to the Dakotas, especially southern Canada. They're from Europe. That's common with a lot of the grain and fiber varieties. You know, I've learned more about latitudes in different parts of the world than I ever imagined. And, you know, Italy's latitude is like 38 degrees to 46 degrees. Ukraine, 46 degrees to 52. Well, I went to school in Minneapolis, St. Paul. That's 45 degrees north. So I realized, wow, this is really far north. We bring these varieties far south, and some of them, many of them, most of them have flowered within 30 days of when they were planted. So this little seedling you see here with a floral structure on it is off of a plant that's 6 or 7 inch tall when we're expecting 6 or 7 feet tall. And so this was a problem for some of the initial fiber hemp observations in Texas. The one variety that Panda Biotech had in their seed giveaway program grew normally. It was from China, and we'll talk about it later, but it went hot for THC. We'll talk about it now. So this is the Lubbock fiber trial in 2020. Here's a variety Altair from Canada, flowered within 30 days. This is the best that we had. We're expecting plants 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 feet tall. Practically no biomass. You can see those stems are basically covered with floral structures. This is a non-starter. This is Jinma from China over here to the left, and you can't see the top of that, but it's about 6 feet tall. And here's the pictures that we see from the northern US. Jinma, same variety grown at Cornell University, New York. Those signs, the top of those signs is about 3 to 4 feet tall. Carmagnola from Italy, another popular variety. It's being, I believe Dr. De Silva has some of that that's growing in the lower Rio Grande Valley. I'm expecting that it probably will go into premature flowering, but some of the Italian varieties are a little bit further south, and one of them I've chosen for some of my fiber or some of our work on fiber cropping, and we're anticipating that it probably should be okay. It's grown mostly in Italy around 40 or 41 degrees north. That'd be equivalent to the northern borders of Kansas or Colorado. Poor quality hemp seed has been a big problem. I mentioned earlier about some seed that ran 20% male. It was supposed to have been feminized seed. I think part of the reason we had poor seed from the many people I've heard about is when people were growing for cannabinoids, they also had some seed in their samples, and they separated that out and they sold it as if it were planting seed. And sometimes as much as 80% of that seed, I think, was not mature. So of course it didn't grow, and yet somebody might have paid $1 per seed for it. So that, again, that was some of the crooked nature that we've encountered in the hemp industry. I think grain and fiber varieties are more hardy. They have in general, they have very little issue with THC. They're more distant from marijuana relatives compared to your cannabinoid lines. So Dr. Hale came to the high plains, and we went to New Mexico in 2019 and shot some video. This is the field we were on. Notice all the blank space, poor quality seed and or poor field management. They did not get the emergence. And on top of that, this is a variety. So it looks to me like there's at least 1, 2, for sure there, 3. This one looks much darker in color here. 4. It looks to me like there's 3 or 4 different varieties out there. Impure seed, maybe, but most of the hemp varieties for cannabinoids haven't been back crossed to get them to be more uniform. And so that needs to happen. I think it will in time. But this kind of mess that you see here in terms of its variability is why some people recommend that you go with transplants, at least when you start, because you should have a much more uniform crop. So I had trouble with poor stands. I listen in on a group that's based out of University of Kentucky, and they have the same problem across the southern US. This has been harvested in the back, but in this one general plot area here, I had about 7 or 8 plants out of the 28 planting points that we had. Everywhere you see a white tag is where we had planted seed. I think part of our problem there was it was June, it was very hot. Hemp seed doesn't like that. You have a soil crust. Hemp seed germinating does not have a lot of vigor or push the way we are accustomed to with other crops, and so has struggles with a little bit of a crust, and it certainly can't seem to be planted more than 1 inch deep, and maybe even 1/2 inch is better. Reagan Noland here at San Angelo in the lower left, this was one of our 2 variety trials. We'll come back to that. The hot soil temperatures in Lubbock, if the air temperature, in one case it was 94 degrees, the temperature on the top of the soil was 122, and that's what these seedlings were encountering. You can see a burnt leaf here. It may survive leaf tip burn here and so forth. So this is a fragile stage, and anything you can do to protect these seedlings is certainly important. I think in the Texas High Plains, the seedling hemp may need to be protected in the same way that seedling cotton also would be from sand and dust storms. So when to plant? We don't have AgriLife information on this. As a general guideline, it looks to me like you could probably reasonably anticipate planting hemp near or shortly after your last average 32-degree temperature in the spring, up to several weeks after that. You could plant hemp in June or July if you want to, but it's hot conditions. And so these are just maybe some reference points there. My variety trial for cannabinoids in Lubbock, I'm anticipating that we'll probably plant that sometime around the 20th of April or so. I've already started a planting date trial for fiber, but that's a different issue there. The key here across all of Texas is the photo period, especially for fiber and grain varieties. And in the literature, it suggests that 70 to 80 degrees is the optimum temperature to grow hemp. Well, we're at least 20 degrees above that most of the year in Texas for at least part of the time, whatever planting date that you would pick. We don't know. I think we can start to answer this maybe in 2021, but there's even the possibility that planting in the fall or winter could be possible in far south Texas. But if you had temperatures like you got in the valley in mid-February, then it probably would be pretty injurious to adult hemp plants. But there is planting at other southerly latitudes to the U.S. Southwest where the winter low, all-time low temperatures are much, maybe 10 to 15 degrees higher than they are even in South Texas. And so they are looking at the possibility you could plant hemp in the fall and harvest in the spring. So I'll talk a little bit about some variety trials here, but this is a good time to pause for a moment and see if we have any comments or questions.
Hey, Calvin, you did mention a little bit, and you showed the slide about the price, market price, and the severe decrease. I did have a question. Anything you know, I know you other states possibly production, but other ideas you might have about that sharp decline in the price?
Well, it was oversupply. 2019, there was about 130,000 acres for CBD harvested in the U.S. And I noted there that Hemp Benchmarks thinks that as little as 40,000 acres in the current environment could meet the demand for CBD. So there was a massive excess. Some of that 2019 production is probably never going to be processed. It's been sitting in warehouses. If it was properly dried, it does gradually deteriorate over a long period of time. And you know, they couldn't even get it, practically give it away. And then, yes, acres were down by 50% last year, in the range of about 70,000 acres, but still probably quite a bit more than we needed. You know, even in Texas with those first, you know, it looks to me like when you take out the larger acreage group based near Lubbock, one farmer that planted 500 acres for grain on the Texas Gulf Coast, which he lost because of heavy rains over a period of about 6 days, and then the rest of it was swallowed up by grass. There was only about 500 acres or so in Texas that was the type of production like you see in this picture, small acreages and so forth. The market is just simply not there. It was in 17, 18. Maybe a lot of the interest in hemp back then was the fad of CBD. I think medical research in time could demonstrate some additional uses, but Aggie math, if you grow 25 acres, that would be a large hemp grow for CBD. 25 acres would be enough to fill 1 million bottles at 900 milligrams. So you can see that it doesn't take a lot of acres to provide a lot of material to the market. That little bottle with 900 milligrams, you know, that's not even a gram. and there's like 28 grams in an ounce. And so you can see what a tiny amount of CBD that actually is. Other comments or questions? Okay, Reagan Noland. Dr. Reagan Noland, San Angelo, had one of our 2 CBD trials. It is a learning experience. Reagan would said, oh, there's several things we'll do differently this year, in 2021 if they have a site there. There was most of what was planted there was transplants, and it was about 98 to 103 degrees the week that he transplanted these. He kept the water on them every day. It took about 2 weeks before it felt like they finally took hold. And from that point forward, the transplants looked pretty good. They were uniform. They were like this row right here. The plants looked very similar. So those are transplants from clones. The feminized seed, you got a lot of variation. The plants that didn't look similar, different maturities. There was one variety at San Angelo that was submitted for growing as both a transplant and as a clone. I'm sorry, as a transplant from clone and from feminized seed. The yields were about the same. The cost would have been lower for the seed, but because of the heat, we actually covered these plants with cheesecloth to try to break the intensity of the sunlight, because the plants really were a little bit too large to be transplanted. They were about 16 inches tall. We'd probably more likely anticipate something that's around maybe 8 to 10 inches tall. So I'm going to explain in 3 slides here some of what we learned from San Angelo, and I'm not going to focus so much, I don't want you to focus so much on the numbers, but some principles here. So this is what I call the as is harvest. We were learning, when do we sample that crop for the required THC? We sampled this one. We were like, yes.
Before you get going on this, I had another question in the chat box that I think may be relevant here. But the days to mature harvest, so from the time a plant emerges to harvest for fiber or grain, are those different, or the day just the amount of time that seed's got to be in the ground?
That's a good question. For fiber, most of those varieties advertise a range of harvest that could be for somewhere like towards 100 days to maybe even 125 days. Those are conditions in other states. The Lubbock trial we had last year, we would have gone from June 12th, so July, August, September, October. We harvested that trial at about 120, actually about 130 days. There was one variety that we waited on a little bit longer. We really only had 2 varieties that we could compare that grew normally. But I think it will depend on when they're planted. The photo period will have an issue. If it's a cannabinoid crop, then it's possible that some of those could be harvested maybe in the range of about 90 days. A true grain crop is going to require the longest maturity. Now, there may be shorter maturity grain crops, but those are things we really don't have a very good feel for yet. But I would say, on our cannabinoids last year at Lubbock and San Angelo, it was probably in the range of about 120 days when we harvested from the day they were planted. So this would be relatively long term. I do see people who want high quality fiber that is not lignified as much, maybe more supple type fibers, less maturity in the plant, that fiber harvest could occur in as little as 75 to 90 days. That might depend on your market and what type of fiber they want. If they want high quality textile type fibers, then definitely they will want to harvest maybe up to a month sooner than if it was more for biomass herd type materials from the woody core. Okay, so San Angelo as is. These were harvested. We knew that we realized that we harvested these probably about 10 days later than we should have. And so these biomass yields, we take with a little caveat here that represents a yield that occurred at a harvest date that was probably a week or 10 days more later than it should have been. Those are the harvest CBD levels. We were in the 9 to 10% range. A number of folks are very focused on the ratio between CBD and THC. Some varieties advertise that they might have a ratio of probably 30 to 1 or 35 to 1 or even 50 to 1. There's our CBD yield. And so I'm interested, like I do with my sunflower work, I want to calculate a value per acre. So based on this yield and that percent CBD at 60 cents a pound, that's the commercial value. That's the as is crop. Here's the outcome that follows the rules. If you were hot here, and 0.33% is probably not going to, may not save you from destruction, then that's the value of this crop if it's hot. And if this happens to you, ouch. I think a rule of thumb here would be, if you're having doubts, what we recommend is that growers who are growing for CBD need to be testing their crop on a weekly basis to track THC over time. 0.8% or 0.8% this week, 0.12% the next week, 0.17% the week after, 0.22% the next week, 0.22, knowing that there's sampling error and error in how that sample is handled, that's probably time to get your official sample and not run the risk of overshooting it. So if you're having doubts about whether you should go ahead and collect your official harvest sample, take that sample. If you are low, then you can say, okay, then I won't harvest yet. I'll wait another week. Then I'll recollect. I'll just discard the first official sample, recollect that, and then go forward. So how we harvest that crop is important. Now, what I've done here is I've taken the data and we've kind of back calculated, because we saw that the ratio of the CBD to THC was almost exactly 1 to 1. So we back calculated that if we had harvested this crop on time, or taken the official sample on time and then harvested accordingly, that this looks like a little bit more realistic expectation of the biomass yield. A ton per acre is very good. A lot of folks don't expect to be more than probably 1,000 to 1,500. CBD levels, there's people want higher CBD than that, but in this particular trial situation in the hot San Angelo, this is what we got. And I think this right-hand column is a little more realistic picture of what the actual value of that crop potentially was if it was harvested at the proper time. This Bayox here at the last is a very common variety. I don't know why it had such low harvest CBD. It's a variety that a lot of people have grown with success, so we're not sure about that particular number. But if on a small hand harvest operation, your labor, your seed starts, everything you put into that, what you purchased, and it cost you $10,000 an acre, then even at a ton, we wouldn't probably be breaking even. And so these are the economics here. If you're not paying yourself, then maybe you make money here at $7,700 an acre. We're not sure about that. But the other thing that I learned out of these trials is that correlation between CBD and THC was almost 1 to 1. A lot of people have said to me, well, I'm going to grow for high percent CBD. And my internal reaction is, no, you're not. Because if you grow for high CBD, then you've probably got high THC. And in this trial at San Angelo, we had 26.5 was our ratio. And so if I multiply that by 0.3, then I get about 8%, which suggests that 8% is probably about the upper level, the upper limit on the range of CBD that I could grow before I would go hot. So one slide on the Lubbock fiber trial. First of all, we had a tough time getting a good stand with most of those varieties. I think that will improve over time. This is this one variety here from Poland. We were able to find floral structures in as little as 17 days after it was planted, not after it emerged, after it was planted. Complete train wreck. The median height for that trial, those plants, was 23 inches tall. You know, a few had a little trace amounts of CBD, but here's the Jin Ma. This was the variety that Panda Biotech used for their fiber seed giveaway to introduce people to fiber hemp. It tested hot. It was the hottest of anything I had, even among the CBD line. So crop destruction. Well, in China, they don't breed for low THC because it's not a regulatory issue there. It's not a legal issue. And so Jin Ma looks like a non-starter, even though it grew normally. That was unfortunate. It grew normally. It and AV1 had no photoperiod issues. But however, the average yield we got here in our first year doing this, and we know what we can do to bump those yields up, but we probably need to be in the range of at least 6,000 pounds per acre, and more likely at least 8,000 pounds per acre to really be viable for a hemp fiber crop. And I've seen some of these trials across the southern US and other states have trouble getting to the kind of yields that they need to be comparable to what you saw in the picture from Cornell University. So that's a challenge that's come here. Panda Biotech they have equipment for a fiber processing plant at Wichita Falls. Our ag agent there, David Graff, doesn't see a lot happening there yet at the site. They would like to have had, they said 30 or 40,000 acres this year, but I think it's going to be very small. And an issue that they've already encountered is one of the two varieties, and the main one that they already have on hand for growers to farm this year for fiber is Heliana, and it's from Ukraine. And in spite of what the agronomist told us, which was planted very, very early, I got my first report on March 30th that it is flowering at less than a month after it was planted. So I'm not anticipating that's going to change much with differences of planting date, but we've got to find fiber varieties that do not go into premature growth before we can have a fiber industry here in Texas. Fungicides, insecticides, herbicides. There's no conventional labels of any of the products that you might be used to. There are about 60 organic materials that are ISO certified. EPA maintains a website. They're suppressives, they're repellents. They're not necessarily something that controls. A few of them might. Most of them have not been tested in university trials, and their cost effectiveness is questionable. But there are people in the organic world that do use these materials. And so if someone has a question about those things, then we would refer them to some of the other specialists within AgriLife for questions. We have not heard of wild hogs or deer being a significant issue on any Texas hemp. We do have some folks that fenced to keep rabbits out of their seedling hemp and their transplants. Because I think rabbits, especially a jackrabbit, could do quick damage overnight if they decided to feed on a hemp crop. Weed management, okay, we don't have a traditional herbicide, so if you got a half acre, you're probably going to hoe everything by hand. Start clean, small acreages. You could consider weed cloth, large acreages. There would be, if it's not organic, there are a few things that you could probably use as a pre-plant, provided it's applied following the label, that it's applied at least 30 or 60 days before the hemp is planted. That's the only real option that you would have for a traditional chemical there. Otherwise, you're looking at mechanical cultivation. This is not weed cloth, but it represents the same principle. There's a drip tape underneath the plastic sheeting here. This was transplanted, and you can see they punched the holes in there, and this field was harvested with a swather, and they came through by hand and picked up any plants that slid under the swather and put them in the row. But they got a problem on their hand. First of all, you see this is a pretty good sized field. It was like another 20 acres out of your vision there to the left, but this crop is way too dry. It's going to crumble and pulverize when they go to bale it up. So they're going to lose, I would imagine, probably 1 or 2% of their CBD because the crop's too dry. Just a couple more slides here. Benchmarks February 21, these are the median prices that are being paid for dry biomass for a farmer, and this based on the price per 1% of CBD or CBG per pound, 50 to 60 cents. CBG was going to be the new hot cannabinoid. The market did not hold up for it as nearly as well as they thought, and I've not seen CBG varieties yet produce more than just a few percent. If you're buying feminized seed, the median price 70 cents each. Clones, the median price was $1.72. So if you have customers, clientele that ask about where you buy, again, we're really not in a very good situation to say, well, we don't recommend. Here are some names of some companies that are active in Texas. I know of 2 companies now that are in Texas that are providing transplants. I assume those are from clones. And Texas Department of Ag's intent had been to say after 2020 that if you were getting transplants, they had to be grown and purchased in Texas, but they waived that for 2021. But if you're on a traditional 5-foot by 5-foot planting grid, you'd have 1,740 plus planting points per acre. So 1,740 times 70 cents, 700, well, that's about $1,200 just for your feminized seed. So you can see this is very pricey. A&M does have an agreement with a lab in Austin, Ionization Labs, and they have installed cannabinoid analysis equipment at 3 different A&M labs, 1 in College Station at the soil testing lab, 2 at centers. Those labs are not and may not pursue certification to conduct the official THC test. That it's costly to get certified at that level. So these labs would be good if you're tracking your THC on a weekly basis, or maybe you're using for quality control. There is some discounts there. Their samples are $59 a piece. They're expensive. They take them like almost 40 minutes to run 1 sample. So that's part of the reason why the cost is high. And you can get some bulk pricing. And I had a batch of samples that I submitted, no official samples, it's 66 samples, and it was $45 a piece. This is the web page for the AgriLife hemp testing service. A customer that's going to use this service for 1 sample or 50, they go on and they pay, enter their information and pay before they send the sample to College Station or to Lubbock or Uvalde. What do we do different in 21? I think the average hemp field in Texas will be planted probably about 2 months earlier. We've got an understanding about seed quality and germination, and when to take that sample. It was 15 days for the required sample in 2020, but that's been changed in the federal rules. You now have 30 days before harvest to collect your official THC sample. I'm working on a planting date study, at least here at Lubbock. Planted my first date March 26. I anticipate this is for fiber varieties. The photo period issue, got to find varieties that don't flower early. I anticipate I'll continue that planting all the way up into August. These were some of the locations that we offered for variety trials. We've had very low response this year, and I'm not sure that even more than just the Lubbock and Chillicothe sites are going to actually make. We have a requirement for a minimum of preferably at least 4 varieties to have a trial at 1 location. And our trials for variety trials for cannabinoids are quite expensive. They are $2,000 for a trial at 1 site, but we have a lot more data that we provide from other states. The hemp industry has been used to giving their seed to somebody and them running a trial without charging for them that. We're not going to do it that way. We have to pay. This needs to be a self-supporting program if we're going to conduct the work. There's some other work going on besides variety trials. Dr. Russell Jessup has 5 sites. He's working on variety assessment, some agronomies, and he's a plant breeder. Dr. De Silva's at Weslaco. 2 other projects that I'm involved with involve, one is rye cover crop going into hemp fiber crop, and then the other one is the planting date trial for the fiber project. So hemp is risky. The folks last year that got their licenses in Texas and did not plant, I don't think are feeling that they missed out on anything other than that they could have learned some things in terms of how to grow the crop. But within the A&M resource, these are some of the individuals that are working with hemp. 3 agronomists. We have plant pathology, entomology involved. Dr. Holly Davis participates in a Southern IPM group related to hemp. We don't have traditional weed control, but if those questions come up, Scott Nolte in College Station is there. And then we also have some economists that have tracked hemp as well. So that is all I wanted to show here on the screen. So I'm going to stop my share and we will finish out with whatever questions we have from the group. Tom, did you have anything that you wanted to add in brief?
Sure. So far, I've been making calls to fields for diagnostics for disease problems. We still don't have a system in place for sending samples to the diagnostic clinic. It's got to be close because I'm in the loop for the official hemp diagnostic form. I noticed it. I thought we approved it in January, but it's not up on the diagnostic clinic website. But essentially, the clinic in College Station and the High Plains clinic that Ken Obasa runs will be the official diagnostic sites where samples are sent to. And if a grower submits a sample, they have to send in a copy of the transport permit and also their license in order for it to get processed. There's a differential in prices. I think they're talking about $75 as a base price for the typical pathogens. If there are virus problems, that'll eventually be sent to the Weslaco specialty clinic for viruses. And that would cost about $125. So right at this point, if any grower reports any problems, feel free to contact me. Sometimes we can clear it up with a photo. What I've done last year is like I said, I've gone out and visited some of these sites. I bring a microscope with me. Sometimes I bring culture media with me. So this bypasses the need to move hemp tissue around the state and can provide an answer. And I've given a couple of presentations on hemp diseases. It's always going to be revised based on what we're seeing. But essentially, hemp is subject to the same soil-borne fungal pathogens that other crops will encounter. For example, San Angelo had a problem with charcoal rot, and that was, of course, related to deficit of water. This pathogen is all over the state. Cotton root rot is present in parts of the state. I've seen that on hemp, and southern blight might be another potential problem. Foliar problems, limited to powdery mildew so far, and that may or may not be treatable with the organics that are currently labeled. For example, neem is labeled for powdery mildew, but I've not seen some data on it. And you'll probably see some other foliar pathogens that are probably seed-borne, but I don't think we have the climate where we're going to see a lot of trouble with them. But anyways, just saying, I'm out here. I'm available to answer disease-related questions. If I happen to see bugs or other insects, I'll get Holly involved as well. That's it.
Thanks, Tom. So Gary Pastashak, I'm looking at your chat comment there. Provide a short list of recommended cultivars for the South Blacklands area. You know, day neutral grain types, I don't think they exist. There are a very few varieties that are considered autoflower. That's the fancy word in the hemp industry. They're day neutral plants, or that they're determinate in their growth. I'm not aware of day neutral plants in the fiber or in the grain. There's a very few in cannabinoid hemp, and they'll probably have the name auto or autoflower in their name. We think that a determinate growth fiber variety could be a good thing in Texas. the company that developed the AV1 or American Victory 1 for Aquaflow in Gunter, Texas, which is near Denton. We've had some discussions with them about the possibility within their germplasm, do they think they could get to a determinate growth fiber variety? We think it would eliminate some of these troubles we encounter with photoperiod sensitivity. Other comments or questions?
Mr. Trossel, my name's Aaron McCoy, and I'm over here in Caldwell County, just outside of Austin. We've had a few people visit the office that are pretty passionate about getting hemp production set up in their local area. One of the biggest issues that I always walk through them is, where are you going to take this once you do this point of cultivation? And that's the part where they always end up with roadblocks.
Yes.
Roadblock A, transporting something like this, and B, where would they even transport something like this to get it processed?
Well, in a perfect world, they're going to have the question about where they're going to go with their crop ironed out before they ever plant. And unfortunately, for last year, the level of curiosity was high enough that a lot of people planted anyway and said, we're going to do this. Maybe they planted 200 plants instead of 200 acres. But like I mentioned earlier, Aaron, we really don't have a list of, say, here are prospective buyers. And if it's for cannabinoids, then, they need to find someone who can most likely do the extraction. That's what the bulk of cannabinoid acres have been used for. They go into extraction. There's different methods, but that equipment can be pretty expensive. The Bayou City Hemp in Houston has extraction facilities for CBD. There's also a grower at Odessa that has the equipment, and he said he would be more than happy to visit with folks and offer extraction services. And so that's the extraction side of things. If it was something for smokable in 2020, the differential on the smokable hemp, or something that you would sell in dried form to be marketed in dried form. A few folks here sent their production to Oklahoma. It was processed there and it was marketed out of state. Now, with the Department of State Health Services decision not to permit or allow smokable hemp, then the lawsuit and the injunction that does temporarily allow that, I'm not sure how that's going to work out. The legislature didn't tell DSHS that smokable hemp would not be allowed. That was their decision, it appears. But, they've got to have a transport permit. If they have product from, say, they're east of Boston and they want to ship it down to Bayou City for extraction, they got to have a transport permit for each bunch that they send. If it takes 2 truckloads, then that's 2 transport permits. But in terms of who they're going to find to do extraction, we don't have any ready answers about that. There's names that we could suggest, but we haven't had a chance to really say that, we don't know if that's a reputable group to do business with. We don't know yet. It's so new to us.
All right, good question, Aaron. Any other questions before we adjourn? I know you can tell we've got good folks on the ground that are helping agents work with clientele as they ask these questions. Dr. Trossel again leading that group, but as Dr. Isaac Heat, Dr. Davis, of course Josh McGinty, and others that are knowledgeable about the crop. Jordan Bell, I believe, is on, and Jordan certainly a resource person as well. So we've got people out to answer those difficult questions for you. But other questions now before we adjourn. If you've got those, and please speak up or put them in the chat. We've got Calvin right there. He's got his headset on, ready to go.
Well, Todd, it looks like this wraps up. And so you have a recording, and I sent you a PDF. Where will those be?
I will have that. I've got mine are recorded to the cloud, and so I'll download that. They don't like us to leave these Zoom recordings up in the cloud too long, so I'll
Okay.
download that, and then we'll make it. Dr. Hale had mentioned earlier in an email that he wanted to make this available
Yes.
on an extension site. So I will track that down and let everyone know where that's located.